Next, former Trump administration National Security Adviser H.R. McMaster on threats to free and open societies. He spoke at an event hosted by the Hoover Institution from Stanford University in California. It's 90 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Gilligan. I'm the director of the Hoover Institution. I want to welcome you to this fourth session of our Centennial Speaker Series entitled A Century of Ideas for a Free Society. This series features 11 panel discussions over the course of the year to showcase the scholarship and research central to the institution's mission and values. At this time, let me introduce the participants of today's discussion entitled The Battlegrounds of Perception, Countering Threats to Free and Open Societies. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. She served as a minister of the Dutch Parliament from 2003 to 2006. While in Parliament, she focused on furthering the integration of non-Western immigrants into Dutch society and on defending the rights of Muslim women. Larry Diamond is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. For more than 6 years, he directed FSI's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, where he now leads the program on Arab Reform and Democracy and its Global Digital Policy Incubator. H.R. McMaster is the Fouad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He was the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years before retiring as a Lieutenant General in June of 2018. The moderator for today's panel is Niall Ferguson. Niall is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and a Senior Fellow of the Center for European Studies at Harvard, where he served for 12 years as a Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of History. Please join me in welcoming this esteemed group to the stage.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Tom, for that introduction, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us on such a beautiful afternoon when you could be out playing Frisbee. I'm extremely excited to be moderating this distinguished panel. When you come to think of it, we have some just amazing expertise up here on the platform. We have a former National Security Advisor who really was the mastermind behind a thorough remaking of national security strategy back in 2018, and we'll talk a little bit about his contribution to that. To my far left, Larry Diamond, whose recent role as editor of a major report on Chinese influence operations has caused a major stir all around the world, both sides of the Pacific. And sitting in my immediate left, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has been the leading critic of Islamic extremism and fundamentalism. And I should, in the interests of full disclosure, acknowledge that she also happens to be my wife. But let me reassure you, there will be no softball questions on this panel. I want to begin with a quotation from one of the, and this is a first, actually. I think the first time we've ever appeared on stage together. We put it off, and finally Hoover talked us into it. Incidentally, our two sons are the first Hoover fellows to be bred in captivity. I want to begin on a more serious note by quoting from one of the Grand Masters of strategic thought and American foreign policy, Henry Kissinger, who, for a man who just turned 96, has an astonishingly acute grasp of the issues that we're going to be discussing this afternoon. He has written on artificial intelligence, and in his book, World Order, he made the following observation, and I quote, "The pervasiveness of network communications in the social, financial, industrial, and military sectors has revolutionized vulnerabilities. Outpacing most rules and regulations, and indeed the technical comprehension of many regulators, it has in some respects created the state of nature, the escape from which, according to Hobbes, provided the motivating force for creating a political order. Asymmetry and a kind of congenital world disorder are built into relations between cyber powers, both in diplomacy and in strategy. Absent articulation of some rules of international conduct, a crisis will arise from the inner dynamics of the system. A couple more quotes just to frame the subject. Admiral Michael Rogers, former head of the National Security Agency and US Cyber Command, said a couple of years ago, "We're at a tipping point." And finally, I want to quote from NSA cryptographer Robert Morris Sr., his famous rules of computer security. And you may want to make a note of these, ladies and gentlemen, because everybody these days has to be concerned about computer security. Rule 1, do not own a computer. Rule 2, do not power it on. Rule 3, do not use it. With that to set the scene, I want to turn to H.R. McMaster. General, I want to ask you about the national security strategy to begin with, because it really did radically change the US posture on a range of issues, of which probably the most noteworthy was our stance towards China. But it had some very interesting things to say about cyber warfare. And I'll just briefly remind you of something that you said. Cyber attacks offer adversaries low-cost and deniable opportunities to seriously damage or disrupt critical infrastructure, cripple American businesses, weaken our federal networks, and attack the tools and devices that Americans use every day to communicate and conduct business. The United States will impose swift and costly consequences on foreign governments, criminals, and other actors who undertake significant malicious cyber activities. So let me begin with a question. Can there be effective deterrence in cyberspace?
Thanks. Thank you, Neil. Well, you asked overall, too, really what motivated, I think, this dramatic shift in policy that you saw broadly in the December 2017, highly readable, just in time for the beach for all of you, national security strategy.
2017. I got the date wrong.
No, but December. It was 2018 is really when we were able to put all this in place. And I think it was really a sense that we were at the end of the beginning of a new era, but we were behind. We were behind largely because we were not competing effectively against adversaries and rivals. And the reasons that we were behind is due in large measure to overconfidence in the 90s associated with our triumph in the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the lopsided victory over the sixth largest army in the world during the 1991 Gulf War. And a period of sustained economic growth through the 90s, what some people called the revolution in military affairs associated with these technologies, the first big dot-com boom here in the Valley as well. And so we were, I think, flushed with this overconfidence that led to complacency. And then we confronted some difficulties in the 2000s. Obviously, the mass murder attack against our nation on September 11th, 2001. And unanticipated length and difficulty of wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and of course the 2008 financial crisis. And I think that jolted our confidence in a way that we actually became, I think, passive and didn't engage competitively for reasons of pessimism rather than over-optimism. And so we made a conscious choice to really figure out how to re-enter arenas of competition from which we had been absent. Cyber is one of those. And to answer your question more succinctly at this point is that yes, I think you can deter certain attacks in cyberspace really by two fundamental means. One, which was alluded to in that paragraph, which is to impose costs on a cyber actor or make clear that you can impose costs far beyond those which the cyber actor factored in at the outset of the decision to attack you. Now, those are cyber offensive capabilities, but also capabilities outside of cyberspace that you can bring to bear American power in physical space through sanctions and law enforcement actions, but when you have the authority to do so, military action as well. But the other aspect of deterrence is really, to go back to Thomas Schelling in the 1960s, deterrence by denial. Convincing potential adversaries that they cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of that capability. And that involves some defensive measures. In fact, are making our infrastructure more resilient and ensuring that any of our systems can degrade gracefully rather than fail catastrophically. We have a recent reminder, obviously, of this ransomware attack on the city of Baltimore, for example. These are problems that are with us right now. And I think we have to recognize that our enthusiasm for technologies that made our lives so much easier have also made us more vulnerable and maybe prone to catastrophic collapse. I mean, I'm reminded of Elton Morrison's book from the 1960s as well, entitled Men, Machines, and Modern Times. And in it, he said that man and woman, and he's writing in the 60s, have expended a great deal of effort in trying to tame his natural environment, but in so doing has created an artificial environment that is much more complex than the natural environment ever was. And so I think we're on the right track in terms of recognizing this as a competitive domain. I think you've seen a lot of critical actions taken to make it easier to use, for example, offensive capabilities as a part of deterrence and defense. But I think there's certainly a long way to go, both on deterrence by denial and the ability to impose costs.
Before I turn to Ayaan and Larry, I want to pursue this a bit further because we have an opportunity to learn from somebody who, remember, has been right there in the room where it happens, making and remaking American policy. Joe Nye of Harvard wrote a recent article on this subject, and I'll quote from it. Deterrence in cyberspace is more like crime governments can only imperfectly prevent it. So it's not really like deterrence in the age of the Cold War, where you had to deter the Soviet Union from firing a missile, because if they fired a missile, that was it. We were in World War III and Armageddon. This is a slightly different kind of deterrence. You're going to have cyber attacks. In some ways, cyber warfare is a permanent state. It's just a question of whether you can keep the level down so that you don't suffer serious disruption. Is that the right way to think about it?
I think that is the right way to think about it, because I think cyber actors are trying to avoid the imposition of costs back on them as well. And cyber is a way where we have seen rivals, competitors such as Russia, China, but North Korea as well, and Iran, try to accomplish objectives below the threshold that would elicit a concerted response back against them. And so I think we have to do a number of things. One is to develop a range of capabilities that can be applied against these actors. I think you've seen that in the last election, for example, in the midterm elections. I think more and more will probably be known over time, but we did act, I think, much more aggressively than we had in the past against those who were trying to disrupt our elections. And there are other actions we can take, though, as well, that aren't purely defensive, but in many ways inoculate ourselves against the effects. And I know that Larry and Ayaan are going to talk more about influence operations and cyber-enabled information warfare, but we can undertake a lot of important tasks like educating ourselves and our public so we're less susceptible to manipulation by these actors, or we can figure out a way to present credible information based on verifiable sources and be able to access that routinely in a way that just sort of blocks out some of that attempts at disinformation and propaganda.
Can we draw that distinction out a little bit more? Because I think there is a distinction to be drawn between cyber warfare and information war. And in some ways, the United States spent much more time thinking about cyber warfare prior to 2016, maybe because we kind of invented it. And our assumption was, well, if we can do certain things to Iran, sooner or later somebody's going to try and do those to us. So we should be really worried about computer viruses and malware that might disrupt the software that controls our critical infrastructure. And that was our focus. Right. But in fact, what the Russians did in 2016 was something quite different, which was information warfare. Can you help us understand the difference?
Well, I think that what we it gets back to this complacency problem. I think that we believed in the 1990s, a corollary to this sort of overconfidence, is that we believed that there was an arc of history that had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. And then it was our confidence that came under attack, our confidence in who we are as a people, our common identity. We know that 80% of the messaging and bot traffic and so forth on social media from the Internet Research Agency, right? The GRU, the Russian intelligence arm, was aimed at dividing Americans along lines of race. The second highest, distant second, was on immigration, and then gun control. Whatever could be a polarizing issue that can pull our polity, our society apart from each other and pit us against each other, and then to attack our election so that we also don't have faith in our democratic processes and institutions. And so I think that we came late to the game on this. We certainly did, and I think it was, again, because we were overconfident in just the inherent strength of our society and our system.
And I'm glad you observed a moment ago that we did up our game. And although it didn't get much coverage, the fact that there wasn't effective disruption of the 2018 midterms has to be down to the way the administration hit back at the Internet Research Agency and actually disrupted its communications. So you could, I think, say that we did learn, and learned pretty quickly from 2016.
And I think one of the lessons overall, to get back to your point on deterrence, is you can't separate in cyberspace offensive and defensive. And we know it's it's public knowledge that if you develop a cyber tool and you use it, it has a shelf life of about 96 hours until there's a countermeasure deployed against it. So what you have is what Clausewitz said war is, right? A continuous interaction of opposites. And that's happening now, at electron speed internationally in this new form of competition. And so what we had to do is align the authorities for those who are operating to defend us from these actors, to employ combinations of offensive and defensive capabilities.
So this is a good moment to turn from you to Ayaan and remind ourselves that although there has not been a major Islamist terrorist attack in the United States for some time, it hasn't stopped around the world. And just to remind the audience, these are numbers from the US National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. Their most recent report, data for 2017, records 10,900 terrorist attacks of all kinds around the world, which killed more than 26,400 people. The top 3 perpetrators were Islamic State, the Taliban, and Al-Shabaab. Overwhelmingly, the terrorist incidents around the world that kill people in large numbers are driven by or perpetrated by radical Islamist groups. So I wanted to begin with a question about those groups, the ways in which they have used the technology developed in the West to organize, to mobilize, and to build far bigger networks than Al-Qaeda had back in 2001. Talk a bit about that, educate us about how these networks currently operate.
Well, thanks. I wanted to start by, I was listening intently to my colleague H.R. and thinking, okay, so here we are talking about operations. This is cyber. Here are the people who are using, our adversaries who are using cyber. And in the 15 years that I've been in the United States, the one thing, maybe even since 1989, the one thing we rarely talk about are ideas, ideologies, and grounding principles. So when HR said, the very core of our identity, I automatically assume very subjectively that the core of our identity are these classical liberal ideas that the United States is established upon. And what we then forget is that there are, in fact, people who organize, who have political and social frameworks that are radically different from ours. So when you think about Islamism, It is a political and social philosophy with a religious underpinning. And when the agents of these, or the people who believe in this ideology, I think you look at Islamism and you see a tree with two main branches. And one branch is the use of violence to achieve their aims, to achieve what they think of as the utopian idea. And the utopian ideal is to establish a society on a local level, regional level, and maybe on a global level to achieve an end goal that society is based on the rule of God. That's their interpretation. That's their organizing philosophy. Now, there's this, think of it as a tree. So one branch is then the use of violence to reach that goal, and that's called jihad. And I think most Americans, everywhere I go, I ask people, raise your hand if you think you know of the concept of jihad. Just raise your hand. And that's exactly it. A lot of people, maybe 80 to 90% of a room like this one will say, I've heard of the concept of jihad, I've read about it, I'm familiar with it. And then I ask people, raise your hand if you've ever heard of the concept of Dawa. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's always a minority. But that is the other main branch of the Islamist tree. And what does that mean? It means that the believers in this particular political and social philosophy that has its underpinnings in religion uses or puts together an effort in engaging in campaigns, arguments, thinking, propaganda. In short, it is the effort to promote the ideas. It's the effort to persuade. And that's where cyber comes into. I know that when it comes to jihad, and we're focusing on that, and these big companies, Google, Twitter, whatever, they're focusing on the jihadi aspects. When are they plotting a terrorist attack? Where is that terrorist attack going to be? What kind of medium are they going to use? That is all under the branch of jihad. But when it comes to Dawa, you have to ask yourself, how are they using cyber to raise awareness, to recruit people to their cause? How are they using cyber to organize, to strategize, to exchange tips and tactics? How are they using cyber to raise money? And yes, information warfare. How are they using to propagate conspiracy theories? The United States of America is out to get all Muslims. That is one conspiracy theory. They're colluding with the state of Israel to destroy Islam. That's another conspiracy theory. If you ask me, I will say the concept of Islamophobia, I put it under that realm of disinformation and information warfare. And that's how it's used. And I think everything that my colleague H.R. said is absolutely true. We are used to fighting these operational wars. The two things that you mentioned, make sure that you impose cost on them, and what did you say, defense by denial. That works on the operational level. But the question remains, are we really engaged in terms of this ideological confrontation, and are we not really wasting the opportunity to use the internet, to use cyber to promote a counter-ideology and a counter-idea and a counter-system of ideas? And I think that's where we are failing.
So one of the things that most struck me when I was writing a book related to all this, The Square and the Tower, was how very different Islamic State was from Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda had carried out the 9/11 attacks partly because it was so cut off and closed as a tiny conspiratorial network that it pretty much was undetected by our security forces. Whereas Islamic State is quite different. It is a very open, though rapidly changing network that uses social media, uses all kinds of different platforms to disseminate its ideology. And you look at some of the work that's been done by people in national security in the US that graphs the network of Islamic State activity online, and it's absolutely mind-blowing how big this thing is and how sophisticated. So is it right to say that Islamic State may have been defeated on the ground in Syria, but it is still very much alive in cyberspace?
So think of Islamic State as only one brand of this global phenomenon of Islamists. Al-Qaeda is just another brand of Islamists. And Al-Qaeda failed because they put all their money on the jihadist branch. They thought we're just going to shock the world into submitting to our view. And that didn't happen. They were obliterated, or almost obliterated. And obviously they adapt like we adapt. They learn from their mistakes like we learn from our mistakes. And I think they've always gone back to, well, let's develop or redevelop or refocus on that Dawa branch, on persuading individuals, getting into the minds of human beings to persuade them to come to our viewpoint. And the way to do that is through schools, it's through families, it's through neighborhoods, it's through communities, and obviously it's through the internet. And they're making use of all these various tools that are available to all of us. Now, I want to say, we in the United States, or people who try and study because we're academics, we try to draw these straight lines of distinction between Al-Qaeda, between Islamic State, between the Muslim Brotherhood and other organizations, but that's not how it works. You have to think of them. If the global tree, if the tree is Islamism, they have their disagreements on tactics, they have their disagreements on how to get to the end goal, but remember, they agree on the end goal. So a lot of communication takes place, a lot of collaboration, a lot of exchange of money, a lot of commitments. All of that happens, and much of it happens through cyber, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that while we focus on brands like Islamic State, we're missing the big picture. I see right now reconfigurations, reunions between the Islamic State and the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and some of the Iranian Shia Islamists. But you read any of our newspapers and you'll be told the Sunnis and the Shias are killing one another. That is the case, but that's only part of the story. And a lot of the communication takes place through cyber, through the internet. But then when our government, as HR described, makes it very difficult for them to use cyber, they turn back to the old methods of communicating and carrying out.
So one question I wanted to ask you specifically about Dawa, non-violent extremism, is how important the internet is in the process of radicalization. Often one reads, usually after a terrorist attack in Europe or somewhere else, that the perpetrator was radicalized online. Is that actually what happens?
Yes, there is a school of thought, a number of people who believe if we shut off all of their social media accounts and all their internets, then radicalization would be minimized or would disappear, and I tend to disagree with that, and I think that by the time an individual goes to his smartphone or laptop or whatever to access any of these social media tools, they have already at least been inspired. That is, that at a minimum, they've been inspired to rethink things. Now, think mostly of young people. They're looking for some kind of moral guideline. And when you think about morality in your 15, 16, 17, I think very often, outside of the West, about 90% of people will think about going to their religion. Now, you can go to your local imam, but most of those local imams have been displaced. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar have put a lot of money into putting their own imams and their messages and an entire infrastructure in place that has displaced that local, get along Islam that was established in most places in the world. So you're a young person, you live here, you live in the UK, you live in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka, you're thinking about the difference between right and wrong, you think you're going to your local imam, you go to the mosque and you listen to a sermon. And they tell you about this worldview that is so coherent, so clear, with its rewards in the hereafter and the sacrifices that you have to make. And it is only then, because it is so complex, that I think many individuals think, well, because they give you references, like we give references. At the end of my talk, I say, why don't you go to the Hoover Institution website? Or why don't you go to the classical liberal website, this, that, and the other? They do the same thing, and that's what you see happening on cyber. People then coming onto these references and thinking, okay, now I'm going to get more information, and they get sucked in. But cyber is only part of the story when it's used that way.
I'm going to come back to a bigger question that I want to ask you about the open society and its enemies, since the open society
that's what it is, yeah.
is in the title of our event, and I know that you're a devoted reader of Karl Popper, but I want to turn now to Larry, and we've talked about Russia, we've talked about Islam, let's talk about China. Your influence operations report talked quite a bit about technology theft, but it struck me that it said relatively little about China's online activity, and I'd like to ask you to talk a bit about that. I wonder if we ain't seen nothing yet, because in some ways, compared with the Russians, the Chinese haven't really begun information warfare. Should we be bracing ourselves for that now?
Well, thank you, Neil, for that question. I want to begin, since we're now talking about China, by noting that 30 years ago today, the Chinese Communist Party state ordered the People's Liberation Army into Tiananmen Square and used a massive and brutal military force to suppress what was probably certainly the most important democracy uprising since the nationalist revolution. We don't know how many people died in Tiananmen Square. The estimates are somewhere between 2,500 and 10,000 people. But it was a seminal moment in the history of modern China, and marked, as the brilliant essay by my co-editor of that report, Neil, Orville Schell, noted in his superb article in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday, a really decisive pivot away from reform and toward the neo-totalitarian Orwellian, and now I'd say increasingly aggressive state that the People's Republic of China has become. I think that before we talk about the cyber element of this in China, which I'll come to, we need to talk about generally what they're doing. And no state in the world has a more dedicated international and institutionalized within the Communist Party apparatus. We've got a whole complicated chart in our report that just unveils and maps the bureaucracy that has a more dedicated infrastructure for propaganda and the promotion of influence around the world in subterranean and illicit fashion than the People's Republic of China has. And you don't, as Ayaan just said, you don't have to be doing this online in order to have tremendous impact. And you know, they've got now, they have gathered all of their communications channels, the China Global Television, China Radio International, the Xinhua News Agency, and everything else they've got into something they've called a very original title, The Voice of China. And this is increasingly centrally directed as part of a massive campaign to propagate you know, their narrative around the world, to suppress other narratives, to buy up newspapers and inserts in newspapers and radio stations, to propagate a dominant line. And one of the most disturbing things that our report found, again, not yet coming to the online element, is that if you look at the Chinese language media in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in the major democracies of the world, forget about Africa and Latin America for the moment, it's now predominantly parroting a pro-Beijing line. So in our democracies, we have lost freedom and pluralism of information. And what we have is Chinese state Communist Party propaganda and Chinese direct intimidation within our countries of alternative voices, to the point where I was just informed yesterday of a city council member, I won't name the city, but you know, let's say it's in California, who was told by an official of the Chinese consulate that if he met with a representative of the Taiwan representative office, the Chinese overseas community would mobilize their power to defeat this person in the next election. This is happening in the United States of America, not in some Asian semi-democracy or in Latin America or something like that. So we have a very serious problem. Then when you, and of course we can look at what they're doing to penetrate the media, the universities of the United States, not just the Confucius Institutes, more than 150 of them in the United States, where the Chinese Communist Party Ministry of Education is writing the curriculum and appointing the instructors to teach Chinese language in the United States, something that I find inexplicable that we're letting happen in the United States of America. And that I think we could end very simply by simply adding a new National Defense Education Act that provides for federal government funding of Chinese language instruction in the United States, which is an important national security objective. But let me add, Neil, that we engaged, to build on HR's point about overconfidence and complacency, we engaged in the late 1990s in a bipartisan act of unilateral disarmament. Jesse Helms wanted to shrink the international affairs budget. The Clinton administration wasn't ready to fight it and had a number of other priorities. It was basically give me your left arm, USAID, or your right arm, USIA. And so the Clinton administration surrendered and closed down the U.S. Information Agency, which was our instrument for fighting communist and terrorist, illiberal and authoritarian propaganda around the world. That got merged into the State Department, into a new Bureau of Public Diplomacy that has had, on average, about one undersecretary every 18 months, and it's never been effective. Now, recently, again, fortunately, a bipartisan initiative, we've seen the creation, and under Secretary Pompeo, it didn't happen under the previous secretary, a serious effort to stand up a global engagement center to wage this battle of ideas. It's going to have, it must have, a digital counter-narrative and counter-messaging component. But that isn't enough. A lot of the way that people get news and information is not digitally. It's the old-fashioned way, by reading newspapers, listening to the radio, and so on and so forth. And let's say we're talking about a closed society, which we need to penetrate in Iran or North Korea in particular. How are we going to get through there? In North Korea, it's not going to be by digital means. But we could take the entire, or not maybe the entire, but quite a large swath of the classic canon of liberal ideas that I think Ayaan was referring to, put it on thumb drives, and infiltrate quite a large number of them at very low cost into the People's Republic of China, into North Korea, and into a lot of non-permissive societies. These aren't even expensive initiatives, but you know, we're not thinking creatively enough, and we really aren't yet, even now, when we are getting more serious, I don't think we are matched and resolved for the era that we're in.
Is this a structural problem? The Chinese have an authoritarian system. They have a great firewall to keep content out that they don't like. They have the golden shield for online surveillance. They have the great cannon which they can point at anybody that they want to take down. And it just seems to me that it's become a very asymmetrical contest.
It has.
Even if we do, as you're saying, fundamentally we're an open society, and it's harder for us to do to them what they can do to us, no?
Well, that is absolutely true. We note that in the report. That is why we stress in the report the need, which whatever your opinion may be of other policies of the Trump administration is pursuing vigorously, and I'd say with some considerable effectiveness to get more reciprocity in the relationship. We can't just sit back passively and say, we'll wage this battle with one arm tied behind our back when they have kind of all four limbs to run with. And that means if our media companies, our television companies, this is my own opinion. I will concede to you, I couldn't sell it to my working group. But nevertheless, I feel it very strongly. If we can't get our cable television channels to be able to broadcast, whether it's in English or Chinese, to the Chinese public, why should China Global Television have access to our cable television airways? That's not obvious to me. If our scholars and journalists are increasingly being threatened with visa denials if they say or write something critical of Xi Jinping or the Chinese Communist Party leadership, why should they continue to have unfettered access in the other direction? These are some of the ways that I think we will never eliminate the asymmetry, but I think we can narrow it and fight back. I want to say one other thing, Neil. It's asymmetrical in both directions because we have an intrinsic advantage here that they don't have. And that is, I feel this very, very deeply. The truth is on our side if we can mobilize it and broadcast it and penetrate it and counter the lying narratives against it around the world. You know, Edward R. Murrow, who was John F. Kennedy's, I think, founding director of the U.S. Information Agency, had a very good line. He said, "The truth is the best propaganda, and lies are the worst." Because lies eventually can be exposed, but we need to expose them. And that means in Africa, in Latin America, we have to show people the truth about this society. What are people going to decide about the relative value of the two systems when they really get a rounded exposure to the United States with all our divisions, with all our warts, with all our flaws, and see 2 million people of the Muslim minority Uyghur ethnicity in Xinjiang province sitting in concentration camps purely because of their ethnicity? Most people don't know that, and we need to make sure they do. And we have evidence to show them.
I'm really struck listening to you, Larry, by the echoes of the Cold War. And you're harking back to what
that's your word, not
did
mine.
In the Cold War. Well, if you're citing the Kennedy administration's efforts to counter Soviet propaganda, you've taken us back there. And I wanted to turn this back to H.R. There is a sense that we are moving towards, if we're not already in, Cold War II. And in Cold War II, we will be having to do just the kind of things that Larry's talking about. We'll have to have a much more coherent sense of the need to combat the other side's propaganda. When you were in government, how did you think about this? And has your view changed since you came here to Hoover in civilian life?
Well, Neil's a fellow historian. You know that we are skeptical about facile uses of historical analogies. And it's important to look at every situation on its own terms while learning really from observations about past experience in the Cold War. I think what everybody recognizes is what's fundamentally different about this competition with China is that we are intertwined with the People's Republic of China economically, and this is part of a global economic system, which you know far better than I do as an economic historian as well, that is far different from the isolated economies of the Cold War period. So whereas we must compete, we may have to compete in different ways. But this competition, I think, gives us some more opportunities. I think Larry's comment about, is that we do have the truth on our side is borne out by the Chinese Communist Party's failure in any way to deal with not only the Tiananmen Square massacre, but any kind of movement toward representative government and democratic governance and rule of law within China. And our colleague Michael Oslin has a great essay in Foreign Policy Today about that, about the repression of historical memory within China. So I think we can mobilize in some ways history to counter those who say, oh no, the Chinese people really like to be oppressed by an authoritarian regime, or what I would characterize as bigotry masquerading as cultural sensitivity among those who say, well, you know, the Chinese are just kind of, you know, they're really deferential to that kind of hierarchical order. It's sort of a Confucian thing that they can be, you know, preyed upon by their own government. And of course, Taiwan is an example to counter that as well. So I think we have to compete in different ways from an ideological perspective, but also from an economic perspective. And we do see opportunities now, obviously. And I think what you're going to see following what has been really a concerted effort to call China out on unfair trade and economic practices, as well as a sustained campaign of industrial espionage, in the form of December 20th of last year. You know, the conventional wisdom is that the United States is on its own now. We don't work with anybody. December 20th of last year, 16 nations simultaneously called out the Chinese hacking organization APT-10 for their industrial espionage activities, sanctioned that organization, and announced a number of indictments in multiple countries of individuals associated with it. And I think what the next step is, and what you've called now not just a trade war, but a tech war with China, I think you're going to see, can I quote Gwyneth Paltrow here with the conscious decoupling?
Not sure that's allowed, but hey.
But a decoupling of our economies such that companies are no longer going to accept the risk of operating in China for short-term profits, because their intellectual property is then stolen and transferred to the state and used by, in many cases, state-owned enterprises to overproduce at low cost and dump goods back into those economies and drive those companies out of business that were attracted initially by short-term profits. So I think that what is going to happen economically, commercially, will in some ways mirror what we've seen happen with the internet. There is now, I think, a divergence, and our colleague Secretary Rice has made this comment as well. You know, a divergence toward two separate systems. Now we're gonna have to manage that carefully and try to mitigate, you know, the downside of that. But I think we're entering a fundamentally new phase in the relationship between the United States and like-minded countries and the People's Republic of China.
It's interesting that I think Europeans increasingly share that view. I was in Europe over the weekend at a conference of essentially transatlantic participants, and this conference has been going on for many years, all the way back to the 1950s. It's kind of interesting to see how attitudes have shifted. At the same conference in 2016, the view was Donald Trump could never be elected president of the United States, and by the way, Brexit could never happen. The same conference, 2017, which I believe you were at, was this is the worst possible situation we could ever be in. What an utter nightmare we're living through. The conference 2018 was, I guess we're going to have to get used to this. And last weekend, they are now so on board with the Trump administration's policy on China that there is almost no daylight between the Europeans and the United States. It's been an amazing transformation. But Ayaan, I have not seen the same transformation in attitudes towards Islamic extremism. In that sense, the Europeans don't seem at all interested in the way in which the administration is thinking about this problem. And I'm particularly struck by the fact, going back to something that you said, that if there's going to be a fight, a kind of cultural fight to combat Dawa, to combat non-violent extremism, the Europeans are not going to be in that fight on the right side.
I think what we see behind the scenes is there's a hope that the new Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, with his Vision 2030, that if only we give them a chance, if only we collaborate with, you know, the oil-rich countries of the Middle East and divert their attention away from spending money and lots of money and lots of you know, propaganda on Dawa, and instead diversify their economy, their populations will somehow come to live by the principles of freedom and tolerance and equality. They'll be just like us.
Kind of thought what we thought would happen with China, if we engaged economically with them, that they would become more
So that
open.
is an old thing. And I think when we talk about overconfidence, I think for a long, after 1989, that sentiment in the West has been very, very strong. You know, we defeated the Soviet Union not only on military grounds, but we defeated them in the battlefield of ideas. Communism, Marxism, socialism, that whole deal, it doesn't work. They gave up. We won, and there was just this sense of, you know, it's the end of history. Why don't they? Everybody's going to come to our way of thinking and our way of doing things. But then, at the same time, that overconfidence went along with an insecurity about our basic principles, the founding principles of this country. People are promoting in colleges these terrible, I mean, we're in the grip of a terrible, terrible nonsensical idea that is, it's summarized in the four-letter word woke. You hear phrases like toxic masculinity, white privilege. You dive into this, and what do you learn? That the history of this country is all about exploitation. It's all about slavery. We're fighting amongst ourselves to bring down the statues of the people who established our history. So there's, on the one hand, the overconfidence. Since 1989, everybody's going to become like ideas when it comes to our principles, but we are inhibited when it comes to propagating our principles because our principles are evil, white privilege, and all that nonsense. So I think at some point we have to come to a place where we shed this identity politics. You know, HR was talking about how our adversaries can come in and exploit our weaknesses and where we are polarized. And so if we amplify racial, you know, confrontations, a polarization between men and women, between children and their parents or level of authority, transgender, LGBTQ, RST, you carry on. You start to fragment our society along these very thin and narrow lines, mostly based on biological ideas. Then we lose sight of what these founding principles were. And so do we really, I think it is very easy to persuade the populations of the Middle East, of Latin America, of Africa, that the basic principles of classical liberalism are superior to the basic principles of radical Islamists, okay? It's very easy for us to do that. We can prove it empirically if only we propagate it. So we have to marry our overconfidence, everybody's going to become like us by actually promoting the ideas, not just the material goods. People want cars, they want smartphones, they want to wear trousers and miniskirts. That's all true. But they forget what are the underlying basic principles. Can we sell the idea of capitalism? Can we sell the idea of free enterprise? Can we sell the idea of political freedom? If we can't do that, we'll end up becoming like them instead of them becoming like us. And I see a bit of that happening in Europe.
Larry, before we go to the audience, and we are going to go to the audience very shortly, so you better think up some difficult questions for the panel.
Yeah.
And if you don't, I'll cold call some people just to get things started.
Right.
Larry, you've written about a democratic recession. If you take a step back and consider the global picture, do you feel like Ayaan that there is a fundamental disadvantage as far as democracy is concerned? Partly that it's an open society and therefore can't have great firewalls, partly because of our internal divisions, which do feel worse than they were in the Cold War. Talk a bit about that democratic recession you've written about, and if there are ways of combating it, because it's one thing to observe it, but the real challenge is to decide how to turn the tide back in favor of democracy.
Well, you're really asking me to summarize a whole book I've just published. So
you can do that. Give me the elevator
but I can't
pitch,
do it
Larry.
in 20 seconds, and I want to carry on with the theme that Ayaan just sounded. Let me just say these bullet points. First of all, if you look at the data from Freedom House or The Economist magazine or most other ratings agencies on the democracy and freedom front. We've been in a 10 to 12 year stagnation, and now I think increasingly slide in terms of freedom and democracy in the world. It's been getting worse for a lot of reasons. I think rising income inequality is a part of it. The divisions we've inflicted on ourselves, I agree with Ayaan, is a part of it. The immigration crisis, and I think the lack of sensitivity and effectiveness of, in many ways, I'd say liberal and well-intentioned government leaders, but nevertheless ineffective. I think Angela Merkel was very naive in the way she handled this in Germany. And you know, the election of Donald Trump shows you got to have your ear to the ground in terms of people's concerns about this. So I think there have been a lot of drivers of democratic dysfunction, polarization, cultural backlash, whatever you want to call it. And then you've got the big factor that I think many people have not been paying attention to until recently, and I'd say the December 2017 National Security Strategy that H.R., I think, led the drafting of, was a big factor in helping to educate Americans and really the world that we're in a new era. It's an era of return to great power competition. We've got resourceful, dedicated, and to some extent narratively, if not ideologically driven, big, powerful authoritarian adversaries who are trying to dirty up, sully, discredit, and reverse the very idea of freedom and democracy. Have to push back. And we have to do so. I don't use the term Cold War, Neil, but I think there are a striking number of parallels between where we were at the peak of the Cold War, particularly I'd say around 1960, and where we are now. And one of them was that around 1960, you know, we got back a sense of purpose and self-confidence and energy in the in waging this ideological struggle. It is that. And it's a struggle for freedom, for the open society, for the equal worth of every human being, and against all these sources of illiberal ideas, whether they're radical Islamist, whether they come in the Kremlin version of a kind of white Christian, conservative, nationalist, European stand against the rest of the world, or whether they come in the form of, if not communism, then the China model of authoritarian capitalism being superior. I just want to close with 2 points. And one also, I think, builds on what Ayaan said. There are a number of reasons to be more hopeful about the opportunity we have, not the inevitability, but the opportunity we have than most people realize. And one is, if you look at the public opinion data, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa in the Afrobarometer, you find that even though there has been, the barometer is now 20 years old, even though there's been modest erosion in public support for democracy and liberal values, it remains overwhelming. Yeah. 2/3 of people in Africa, and even in Northern Africa, say they would like to have a democratic system of government. And often the political science skeptics say, well, if you peel it back, there's not much there, it's very superficial. They say they want independent courts. They say they want checks and balances. They say they want their presidents to not be able to serve more than 2 terms. And they say, in various responses to questions, more or less, that they want to be secure in their rights and they want to have an open society. That doesn't sound shallow to me. That sounds to me, and you see it's a little more equivocal now in Latin America and in parts of Asia, but we've got a lot to work with. People actually do not want to live in an authoritarian Orwellian surveillance state where they have no freedom, no privacy, and can be sent to a concentration camp at any point. And if we can't make that work for us in this next round of global competition, we are doing something deeply wrong or, ill-conceived.
Inspiring words, Larry, and I want to actually almost worthy of a round of applause, no? I mean, that sounds to me like I want to invite you now, if you have questions, to take advantage of the microphones that are standing right there on either side of the auditorium. I want to remind you that a question is a relatively short thing with a question mark at the end of it. And if you decide to give a speech, burly men will appear from the side of the auditorium and escort you up. Please.
I'm going to give a speech.
No speech.
Ayaan, thank you so much for your courage and bravery and being voice of the women in Islamic world. You are a real hero, and I am so happy to be here to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
My question, as a matter of fact, I'm looking for advice from you for women like me, or for me, as a matter of fact, because I am in a critical situation. I would like to ask you, because this is the point that I'm going to start to do something about my life. You know, some years ago, Sarah Chase, advisor to General McMullen from Carnegie, was here. Mm-hmm. And I, as a public, never get the chance to ask the question, but afterward I could tell her, share with her my idea about what we should have done in, or should do in Afghanistan. And then she encouraged me very strongly to speak out, speak up, and all those things. And I have lived 35 years in fear of Islam and political correctness and all of those things, because I experienced the revival of Islam and what Islam can do and is doing with the societies. But then she encouraged me very much, and she told me one thing. She said that people in this room, it was CSAC and FSI, needs to hear from you. And she said to me that for these people takes 10 years to understand what you are saying. And I don't think that it means my accent. I think that other things. But I have tried to really talk about Islam, but I am coming to a crashing point right now. I feel that I am hitting my head to the wall, because I feel that I am betrayed by the society of intellectuals that were supposed to support me, my new beautiful country of US that should support me, but I feel that everywhere that I go is this political correctness and many other things. Is very easy, just come to FSI, I can show you what is happening. And right now I am confused.
You've got to get to the question.
Yes, my question is that I speak up against Islam, and I'm thinking that Islam is a imperialistic, violent, pedophile ideology, and we should tell the truth, not going with the lie of the peaceful religion and so on. But I am crashed because people say that don't say, they kill you.
We need a question. We really do. We need a question.
I think she got it.
And then yes, my question is that at the same time, I get silenced down by the professors at FSI and so on, and I am crashing. And I want to ask you honestly, give me advice. What should I do? Should I stop?
Thank you very much.
Going there and stop?
I will be very short and say, yeah, maybe at this stage, it's better to stop talking about Islam and start talking about freedom. Again, we are here today to talk about how we can use online and cyber and all that. And it's now become technologically possible to connect a lot of people and see the ideas that Afghani women from Afghanistan, and I know a number of them, are attracted to the ideas of freedom and equality and raising their children, especially their sons, to be different and to embrace these ideas. And I think that's where to go. Let's stop talking, or let's talk less about what it is that has driven us out of the ideology of radical Islam, and talk about what has driven us to the principles of freedom.
Gentlemen at the microphone, please keep it brief or others won't have a chance.
First of all, thank you very much for wonderful insights. And you don't read this in the New York Times, unfortunately, these days. Thank you. I was trying to think of a difficult question, and I come up with one. I would like to get two perspectives from HR, kind of from the inside the government, and then from Ayaan, kind of from the outside perspective. And the difficult question is this. So Muslim Brotherhood, it's kind of, reasonably obvious that they drive a lot of this nonviolent, jihad, if you will. Sorry for using the word. But at the same time, we have failed so far to declare them a terrorist organization in the United States. I mean, we're trying. I was just reading the news that we're trying again, but it's not happening. So why is that? Why have we failed to declare Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, even though Saudis did, right? That's my question.
Is the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization? Should we identify it as such?
Okay, I'll go back to Ayaan's point that sometimes we do try too hard to disconnect the dots with these groups because these groups are overlapping and mutually reinforcing. But I think also we have to be cognizant of the fact that not all of these groups are the same, especially within the Muslim Brotherhood, which has different chapters that have different philosophies. Some of them are actually active and useful participants in political processes. If you were, for example, to make a blanket designation against all Muslim Brotherhood organizations and encourage other countries to do that, you just have to recognize that what you're going to do is drive those organizations underground in a way that set conditions for post-Mubarak Egypt. Okay, so I think there has to be a distinction made between those who advocate for violence against innocents and those who advocate to be able to determine, with Sharia law, the nature of the government at the exclusion of other parties. And so I think that's the way to think about it. And so there's not going to be a silver bullet solution to the problem of Islamist groups that want to restrict human freedom. And I don't think a blanket designation of the Muslim Brotherhood does it for you.
Ayaan.
I just want to add one. Yeah. So I agree with HR. Everything he said is absolutely true, but I think we could go one step further and designate them an adversary. Just like we've designated, just like we're confronting China and what China is doing, I think it doesn't hurt to say, hey, Muslim Brotherhood, with all your branches and chapters, we know what you're up to, and here's the answer. And that is, it's not exactly a terrorist organization, but having them come to the White House and having them, come in our institutions of education, institutions of information, I think in that sense, I think that's a mistake.
I think just quickly, if I just make a point that maybe for the first two questions is, I think a way to think about this is to really make sure that we understand that terrorists are using a perverted interpretation of Islam to justify their criminal acts. And today is Eid al-Fitr. We ought to say, Eid Mubarak to everybody. Who are the greatest victims of these terrorist organizations? It's other Muslims. And so what we have to do is not play into the terrorists' hands who try to, again, do this conspiracy theory that it's really the Zionist Crusader conspiracy against them. Really what this is a fight between all civilized people of all religions against those who are perverting Islam.
Well said. Question from the right-hand microphone, please, sir.
Do foreign governments enjoy the protections of our Bill of Rights? Do foreign governments enjoy the protections of our Bill of Rights when it comes to ownership of media and of newspapers, television stations, etc.?
Larry, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, I think the answer is no. And indeed, we have blocked Chinese interests from buying radio stations in the United States. You know what they did? They bought the largest wattage radio station in North America in Tijuana, and from there started broadcasting over the border to Southern California. But in any case, I do not think that foreign governments have, and I don't think any court has ever established or even suggested that foreign governments have protection of freedom of speech or freedom of ownership inside the United States, and particularly when they're pursuing ideological objectives that are hostile to our Bill of Rights. I think it would be perverse to suggest otherwise.
The lady in the black dress, please.
I must say, Ayaan, to be in a room with you is such a great privilege, to be in the room with your courageous presence. Thank you so much. So today you've talked about Islamists, you've talked about Russia, you've talked about China as the greatest tyrannical threats, but I believe that we are surrounded by people who think that the greatest threats to their lives are plastic straws, single-sex restrooms, and Trump's personality. So I'm asking, what are the organizations we can support? Where is the greatest hope? Where are the sparks of light that the people in this room can get behind when they leave here to fight the battle that you're describing today?
That's an easy one, the Hoover Institution. That's what we're for. The last bastion of free thinking and the principles of the open society in American academia.
I think also what we do in open and free societies is we have, our internal disputes. We have conservatives versus liberals, Republicans versus Democrats, and others. And sometimes we use an exaggerated language to describe and analyze these differences when really it's not that exaggerated. So the kind of adversity we're facing from China, from Russia, and from radical Islam is very, very different from the adversity that Republicans and Democrats, accuse one another of. And so at times, as a relative newcomer, I think we really need to mind our language and sober up a bit. And maybe that will then one day get us to the quaint idea of bipartisan cooperation. But we shouldn't confuse our external enemies that wish us harm, existential harm, with our domestic differences.
One peculiarity of the period of complacency that followed 1989 and our mistaken reading of 1989 as being all about Gdansk, Eastern Europe, rather than Beijing, was that I think in the absence of external threats, we fell upon ourselves. We divided ourselves more deeply than I think had been true when there was a clear external threat. And it seems to me that one hopeful prospect of our wakening up to these different threats is that we begin to see a return to bipartisanship on precisely these issues. What is the one thing that Democrats do not criticize President Trump for? Standing up to China. Because in fact, they were almost quicker than Republicans to endorse the imposition of tariffs on Chinese imports last year. So this may be one of the unintended but promising consequences of this discussion that we're having. The lady at the microphone on the right.
Thank you for the brilliant conversation. It's a big discussion nowadays whether modern technologies, namely blockchain, AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, military robotics, can really contribute to inclusion, decentralization of power, and helping open societies to thrive further. So, do you believe in the impact of these technologies? How do you see this process going on? And maybe they can even be used against the free society. What's your opinion?
H.R., you're thinking a lot about this right now. You were involved in organizing a really important conference just last week at Stanford on the subject. What's your take?
Well, I just think any technological development is going to have tremendous possibilities associated with it and also dangers. And we learned from our most recent experiences with the internet, which many people saw as an unmitigated good, that it can be used for nefarious purposes, especially within social media, which is also supposed to be an unmitigated good. So I think what's really important is to understand the implications of these technologies for our own security and the preservation of our way of life. And if there are dangers, to put into place mitigating measures from the beginning, but then to also accentuate the positive aspects of blockchain technology, for example, which has been empowered, I think, people in a way that has led to economic growth by being able to formalize land, for example, in ways that can't be corrupted, and then also enables maybe a flattening of financial transactions in a way that is more democratic. So there are positive aspects of that technology, but of course, as you know, encryption is the great example right now of a benefit in terms of privacy, but also a disadvantage in terms of how it can empower terrorist organizations to be able to coordinate efforts broadly without detection.
It was on this stage that last year, Peter Thiel observed that maybe AI was communist and crypto or blockchain was libertarian. And I've thought long and hard about that. But it does seem as if artificial intelligence is going to be the basis of this new Cold War, China may have certain advantages precisely because there are no constraints on individual privacy when it comes to the Chinese platforms mining big data. The gentleman in the pink t-shirt.
This question is mostly for Niall and Ayaan. So the recent European parliamentary elections seem to prove that no matter what Jean-Claude Juncker does, Brexit has not lost much popularity. And in Ayaan's former country, the Netherlands, Thierry Baudet has seemed to make Euroscepticism. And so I'm curious about what the possibility is of this mood moving to the continent and what a young American like me can do to help ensure the collapse of Brussels.
Ayaan, do you want to take that question?
Well, I really want to point to some of the remarks that Larry made earlier, which was, you know, in a free society, the leadership, the people we elect, they have to hold their ears to the ground and listen to the concerns of the people. And I think early on, the European Union was a project that started, in my view, very positive and started with a great deal of good intentions. But over time, people who live in Europe are feeling that they're not being heard, that their concerns are not being taken seriously, that there are people, you know, on a bureaucratic level who are making decisions that have far-reaching consequences for people in their neighborhoods, in their schools, in their day-to-day life, and that they're not being listened to. And when I served in the parliament in the Netherlands, I felt that was a constant thing. We would go as members of parliament to our constituencies and try to persuade them in a certain direction, or we would listen to them, they would persuade us, and we would start, you know, to get a majority for certain legislation, and we would be told, no, that you can't pass that because it's against the EU laws. And more citizens would ask, who the heck are they? Are we now ruled from Belgium or from The Hague? And I think as long as Europeans answer that question with, it's Brussels, you're ruled from Belgium, you're going to have a lot of disaffection. And, you know, Geert Wilders, Brexit, it's an expression of that disaffection, of not listening to, and I think in a free democratic society, if the leadership stop listening to their constituencies, then it's not a democracy anymore. So they better, yeah.
Though it must be said that if you had wanted to do an advertisement for how to leave the European Union, you would not have run British politics the way British politics has been run over the last 3 years. It has had rather the opposite effect on most continental Europeans. But thanks for that question. The gentleman in the T-shirt at the other mic.
Thank you. Wonderful conversation. Larry partially answered this question already about China's right to broadcast in the US as a foreign government. But more generally, how do we decide what discourse is appropriate for a free and open society? Where do we draw that line, and who decides?
Larry, do you want to give us a quick primer on free speech?
Well, I think you always err on the side of freedom of speech. And I'm not in favor of censoring Chinese speech, Russian speech, and so on, but I think giving them access to airwaves or the right to buy a radio station is a different thing. And if they want to spend $500,000 to buy an insert in the Washington Post, well, I guess that's their right. I'm not too worried about that. I don't think many people are reading it in Washington. So, you know, I'd say always, you know, err on the side of freedom of speech. You know, we have, I don't need, I think, to get into it here. I think Niall could give us a real dissertation on this. We've got a problem with freedom of speech on college campuses. And it's really, you know, if we can't bridge the polarization in a university campus and really look at all points of view with something of an open mind and a willingness to debate, we are in real trouble as an open society, as a liberal society. So we got to turn the question back on ourselves in the university environments.
I think we also need to bear in mind that as the network platforms, be it Facebook, be it Google, YouTube, be it Twitter, come under increasing pressure from the woke left to restrict hate speech, we run the risk that there is systematic censorship practiced in the most dynamic part of our public sphere. And I think, our bias should very clearly be in favor of free speech. And although they're not bound by the First Amendment, something like First Amendment rights online. And yeah, that does mean hate speech, and it does mean that we'll hear arguments from the Chinese government, and for that matter, from the Muslim Brotherhood. But that's what a free society is like. The most important thing is that there should be truly an open society, and not least on university campuses. I think we've got time for one more question, and then I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint those at the microphones because A, we've only got 4 minutes left, and B, there are 2 small boys running amok not far from here, and one of us has to get back before the house is burnt down. So the gentleman in the blue shirt goes last.
Brief question. This concerns Chinese influence in Africa. The West has a long history of ignoring global trends that are happening, and while they sleep, things happen. I do a lot of business in China in IP and licensing, and I watched China for many years confiscate Western IP. And now we've seen the trade imbalance grow and grow and grow, and there's no redressing of that. Trump is trying. But what we're missing, of course, is the growing influence of China in Africa. It's an imperialism. They're confiscating resources. Mm-hmm. They're influencing governments, places like Congo. So what does the panel think? How big a threat is that? And what, if anything, can the West do to reverse that influence?
Well, I'm going to ask each of you to respond. You get a minute each, and we're going to end with the one African on the panel. But let's start with H.R.
Okay, so the new vanguard of the Chinese Communist Party, Red Brigade, is a party official in a suit carrying a duffel bag of cash, and what they're using is corruption and working with corrupt governments in particular to co-opt those governments, and then ultimately, once they're there and they create conditions of dependency, often under the rubric of the One Belt, One Road, to then change that to a coercive relationship in which that country is used, as you already alluded to, maybe as a place from which to extract what China needs, but then also to get this country to align with China's foreign policy as well. There is pushback against this significantly across the world now. The curtain's been pulled back. You have small countries like Sri Lanka and Maldives who have changed governments because of the exposure of the corruption of their own government officials. It's happened in our hemisphere, in Ecuador as well. Malaysia is an important case with 1MDB, but also related to Chinese influence. So there's a problem here. But I think there's also an opportunity in context of competing effectively. The first step of which I think is to pull the curtain back on Chinese activity and expose it to some sunlight.
Larry, you spoke eloquently about the African positive attitude towards democracy. Is China undermining that, do you think?
Yeah, of course. I think increasingly Xi Jinping sees democracy anywhere and the model of democracy and an open society and a rule of law as a threat to the China model. They have an increasingly global sense of this. But look, this is where the truth is on our side, and we need public diplomacy to pull back the curtain wider, more vividly, and in the view of many more ordinary people. What's going on can only be described as, gross neocolonialism. First of all, most of the BRI construction is coming through loans at commercial rates that are really exploitative. China calls it aid. I think this is, if it's aid, it's a very perverse kind. And then, of course, the classic instance of the Sri Lankan port of Hambantota, you get yourself $8 billion in debt, and the Chinese neocolonialists come along and say, well, we can write that down by $1 billion if you give us your strategic port for 99 years. And in Australia, you have a little bit of experience with this yourselves. So I think we just have to aggressively expose this. But it can't be all negative. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do, I'd say, to revive maybe with a different kind of logic, but re-energize Western aid flows and capital flows in particular, capital investment flows and infrastructure development in Africa if we don't want China being by default the major actor here. I think the facts are on our side. I think the natural inclination of Africans is on our side, and we just need to organize our effort and our story.
Ayaan.
I'm going to use my 1 minute to say something about free speech and debate and intellectual honesty, also because we're in a university campus and we know that there are a lot of problems going on in university campuses. I want to give you a demonstration. So my colleague here, H.R., has said a few things about the Muslim Brotherhood, and I hold a different view. Now, I have a great deal of respect for him and a great deal of affection for him. But the fact that I disagree with him, I think some of the problems we are seeing, the manifestation of ISIS, Al-Qaeda violence, the subjugation of women, homophobia, radical Islamic anti-Semitism, I think that all of that is baked into the Islamic cake. HR thinks, you know, Islam is being perverted by bad people that are using it for other things. It is possible to sit on the same stage as grown-ups and disagree and share empirical material with one another. You don't have to hate one another. If we can do this and we can demonstrate this, then I think there's, you know, we have things going. Thank you.
It only remains for me to thank my colleagues for their brilliant contributions, to point out that something very like Tiananmen Square might be going on right now in an African country, Sudan, in Khartoum, and China, backed by Russia, blocked a bid at the United Nations Security Council to condemn the killing of civilians in that country. Ladies and gentlemen, that's where we are in 2019. It may not be a Cold War, but it certainly doesn't feel like peace. Tom.
Please. Well, I want to thank our excellent panelists. What a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. I want to thank you for coming, and I hope you can all stay with us. We're going to have a reception in the pavilion, and if you can't stay for that, I'll look forward to seeing you at our next event. Good evening. Thank you, guys. Thank you.